Ladies and gentlemen, and in the interest of time, I shall be brief, concise, and to the point, if there is a point. Here is a message that we had prepared because of certain commitments that we had. I'll read it as it is, and then I'll amend it. On behalf of the Congress of Racial Equality, we extend this tribute to Ms. Ella Baker in recognition of her untiring efforts in the civil rights struggle. It is regrettable that this great occasion should occur at a time when the black people of America and the black people of America mourn the tragic loss of a great and respected leader, Dr. Martin Luther King. Now more than ever before, it is imperative that people of goodwill take their rightful place in our society and join in a common goal, the freedom of all men. We at CORE are especially grateful for Mrs. Baker's personal contribution to the work of our organization, for her valuable consultation over the years, and for her work with CORE, and for the attendance in workshops in Atlanta and on voter registration in North Carolina and the South and elsewhere. It was the considered group opinion of the Congress of Racial Equality, and we, as you have heard in the New York Times, are a dead organization. We are near bankrupt. We do not know where we're going, but our membership has just doubled in the last 3 years. But a group of people said that they wanted to do something for Ms. Baker, and it was a great debate that went on. They said, we want to give Ms. Baker a dress or a hat or some shoes, something that we know that she will put on and wear if we buy it. In the meantime, a series of meetings and problems came up, and everybody went upon their way. So they then said, Brother McKissick said, suppose you give Ms. Baker $100. I said, well, you know, if I give Ella $100, she's going to endorse the check, turn it over to SCEF, and it's going right back into the movement, just exactly what you don't want done. But I'm going to do it. So I'm here for this very reason, to present a gift to Ella Baker of $100 on behalf of so many of CORE people. And the thing about this check, Ella, is that it doesn't represent one contribution from one person. That's what makes it so great these days. As we in CORE have found out, it's better to get 50 cents from every black person in Harlem than to get $1,000 from one. And this is the principle that we're working on. And realizing that the value of the dollar keeps going up and DeGaulle keeps getting wiser while Johnson keeps getting dumber, and the value of the dollar goes down, and $100, of course, is not really what it ought to be. But this represents something when CORE people, you know, all of them voluntarily put something together, and it represents a whole lot of people. And you're about the only person, you know, that's around here that's our age, Ella, that can bring Rap Brown, Stokely Carmichael, Floyd McKissick, and all of them crazy kind of people that this society is afraid of together. So this is a tribute to you, and we are indeed happy to be here, and we want to give you this check, and we're going to say, may you be well blessed, and we won't attempt to choose your religion, but may you be blessed by those gods that you choose to be blessed by. Thank you.
But one very short announcement, and I'm not saying this just for Anne, now don't get that idea, but I have with me tonight 4 or 5 people from the South who are going to help me maintain order, and especially the length of time people speak. And I'm not going to introduce them, but I have 5 Alabama State troopers here to enforce this thing. So I'm now going to give you Anne Braden, who will make a speech. Thank you.
I hope everybody will forgive me. This is something I practically never do. I'm going to read my remarks tonight because the chairman has me utterly intimidated, and that's the only way I can be sure of avoiding the death sentence he has condemned me to if I go over my time. It is my assignment tonight to pinch hit for one of the great women of our time, Mrs. Rosa Parks, whose courage more than a decade ago started a new movement. Obviously, I can't really do that, for no one could take her place. But she is very ill today, and to her great regret, could not come here from her present home in Detroit. She asked me to convey to those assembled some of her feelings about our guest of honor, Miss Ella Baker. Long before the world heard of Mrs. Parks through the Montgomery bus movement, she was already working, doing what was then a revolutionary act, organizing an NAACP branch in the cradle of the Confederacy. It was a time when there was no real movement, only a few courageous pioneers working long and hard in the lonely drudgery that builds a movement, attempting what must have seemed an impossible task. In the early 1940s, Mrs. Parks went out of the state of Alabama for the first time to a regional NAA conference in Jacksonville, Florida, and there she met Ella Baker. In Ella, Mrs. Parks says today, she found the renewed courage and the new inspiration to continue her work. From then on, they were fast friends, with Ella helping her to find within herself the confidence and strength she needed to carry on. I tell this story because I think it illustrates the most important role that Ella has played in the movement to revolutionize the South through at least 3 generations. For what Mrs. Parks says about Ella could be repeated by scores and scores of people if we but knew all of their names. Ella never sought credit for the work she did. In fact, she carefully avoided credit and acclaim. But she helped to build a movement by building people. For many of us, as with Rosa Parks, she made it possible for us to attempt what seemed the impossible. I recall that I first met Ella in the early 50s, when Carl was in prison on sedition charges for what we thought might be 15 years. The situation then looked pretty impossible, and I remember how Ella, already a veteran of many struggles, helped me to put it all in perspective, helped me to analyze the situation correctly, find the most effective and skillful way to fight, and to believe in my own ability to do it. Ever since then, whenever a particularly knotty problem has arisen, I have wanted to talk to Ella. Not that she always has a magic answer, but I know she'll cut through the elements of the problem that don't matter, raise the right questions, and give me faith in my own ability to do the impossible. This is what she has meant to many of us in the movement. It is my assignment also tonight to pay tribute to Ella on behalf of the SCEF staff. But I can't really do that in words. The only fitting tribute to a woman who scorns sham and rhetoric without content is action. In a sense, I think that the program that the SCEF staff is now carrying out is our best tribute to Ella. For what we have attempted through the years to break the shackles of white racism and build a new movement, many people have said is impossible. Some people still say that, although at least now more people see the necessity for it. But we do not let the threat of the impossibility frighten us, and sometimes things begin to become possible. A year ago, many people said, and some still say, that it is impossible to reach poor white people in the South. But today, Bob and Dottie Zellner, who are here tonight, and their co-workers in the Deep South are doing exactly that, beginning to win poor white Southerners away from the dead-end philosophy of racism and organize them around economic and political programs that have meaning for their lives. In the mountain areas of the South, according to some, the people are so beaten down by the system that they can't be organized. But today, our staff is helping them to organize and, drawing on the example of the black people in this country, helping the people in the mountains to see that they can control their own lives. A few years ago, people said it was impossible to build and to organize an anti-war movement in the South. But today, we're doing it. Today, many people say it is impossible to stop the coming of a police state in this country. But through our civil liberties program, we are fighting police state tactics wherever they rear their ugly heads, whether it be Rap Brown in jail for making a speech, black students framed in Knoxville, Tennessee, as is now going on, draft resistors imprisoned in Louisville, and so on. And if it is truly impossible to avoid a police state in this country, this will not have stopped us from trying. This is our program, to attempt the impossible and to make it possible, as our guest of honor has inspired people to do down through the years. This is our living tribute to Miss Ella Baker.
I'm supposed to say just a word about some of the organizing in the South on our project, and later on we'll get to the Mountain Project with Karen Mulloy speaking. But I'd like to say, just give you a brief report of some of the things that we're doing. Dottie and I have been back in the South for about a year now. We're living in New Orleans, and we have now purchased a large house, a great big house in New Orleans, which we are converting into an educational center. We have already had one workshop there, one large workshop, with 30 people from the Delta of Mississippi, Sunflower County and Bolivar County. Sunflower County, as you know, is James Eastland's home county. It was a few over 30 people, and most of them were white. We had 3 black people, and the rest of these people were white from the Delta of Mississippi. Now, very few of us realized that this could occur before we went down and began to attempt it. We thought that it could be done, but we didn't know. But this is happening. In Laurel, Mississippi, we're working with about 2,200 to 25 white and black workers in Laurel, Mississippi. We've had several meetings up there, and they've come down to meet with us in New Orleans. I was in the home of a working man in Laurel, Mississippi on the day of Martin Luther King's funeral. And there was an interesting reaction because this is a white Mississippian whom we have been working with, we've known for about a year, and we've been working with off and on. And he told me that he really understood something by seeing the funeral. He said, I was supposed to mow the lawn today, and they have very large lawns up there. He lives out in the woods, and he's got about 2 or 3 acres cleared, and his wife had told him to mow the lawn, and he said he hadn't gotten to it because he'd been watching the television all day. And he said that he really cried. He broke down and cried when they loaded the casket on that wagon pulled by the mules. And he said something very simple and very revealing. He said, that's when I really knew that he was our kind of people and we are his kind of people. So these are some of the things that we're beginning to find in the South, working with white people and black people together. So we're pressing on. We have a workshop in May with about 100 people from Laurel, Mississippi, most of whom will be white, but there will also be black workers from that area. There are many things happening now, and they grow out of what has gone before. Many of us who were with SNCC, and we were with SNCC from the very early days, we still believe that we're all together. And I think that this gathering tonight is the most telling example, the most proof that anyone would want that we have a damn strong movement going now. And I think it's because of the work of people like Ella Baker in years past, and people like our next speaker, Stokely Carmichael.
Good evening. The political statements of our organization will be delivered by our chairman, our brother Rap Brown, who is here. The political statements of our organizations are usually given by the chairman, who is brother Rap Brown, and he's here tonight. I am not here. I am not here for a political reason. I am here for a personal reason. And I debated coming because I was afraid I would be asked to speak. I speak publicly on political issues. I do not speak publicly on personal issues. I've come to pay tribute to Miss Ella Baker, not only for what she's done for me, but what she's done to thousands and millions of people whom she will never know, who will never be able to touch her, or who will never be able to say thank you. And that is why I'm here. That is all I can say. Thank you.
At this point, I would like to say that part of the work of SCEF in the last few days and the last few weeks has been agitation, as much agitation as we possibly could raise around the imprisonment of Rap Brown. And I would like to say that we did our best, and we don't know if it had any effect or not on his release, but the organization put all of its facilities for the use of this task. And I would like for Rap to stand up, and I would like for Rap to come up and say just a word to you. Now, Rap, could you do that, Rap? I'd like to inform you that while Rap was in jail, he fasted, and I think he fasted for over 30 days. And this had a tremendous effect on the people in New Orleans. And many of you probably don't know, but with a little organizing effort, we were able to circulate a petition in New Orleans, Louisiana, only among white people, and it was signed by 114 citizens of New Orleans, Louisiana. I give you Rap.
Thanks a lot. Really new at this, so you have to excuse me. First of all, I'd like to thank every organization and individual who did anything on my behalf in trying to get me out of jail. And I'm really out by a mistake. I'm not supposed to be out. But in terms of people all across the country, people who are oppressed and people who are fighting against oppression in this country, the battle is yet to come. The real confrontation has not been fought. Oppressed people, black people in this country, oppressed white people, Puerto Ricans, Mexicans, American Indians, Japanese Americans are beginning to recognize that the fight against racist white America, and it is a fight against racist white America, is yet to come. So in paying tribute to one of the freedom fighters, one of the real freedom fighters in this country, and I'd like to say thank you not only to Ms. Baker, but to everyone who's here, and all of the freedom fighters who died in the streets of Newark, Detroit, and who have been dying in this country all along. Thank you.
I'd like to, in introducing the next speaker, read you a letter from another freedom fighter who is not well known, who is a member of the SCEF staff, who worked as an Appalachian volunteer for 3 years in the mountains, who finally understood that the poverty programs and the government programs were not solving the problems of the people, and they were not allowed to organize as they should. This is a person who realized that if he was going to do any significant organizing in the United States on the problems of the people, he had to confront one of the main issues facing us today, the war in Vietnam. When he took his stand on that, he lost his occupational deferment and was fired from the Appalachian Volunteers. He was later drafted and filed for CO, was refused that, and sent to jail for 5 years and fined $10,000. From Joe Mulloy, a letter from jail. Today marks my 9th day in the Jefferson County Jail. It's not really as bad as I thought it would be. A third draft resistor joined us here today, and we are well received by the other prisoners. I've gotten into some good long discussions with fellow prisoners about such things as black power, nonviolence, King's death, the Vietnam War, and the lack of justice in the federal courts. They all liked it when I told them you were all picketing for all of the prisoners who couldn't raise bond money. That would about empty this place. The federal pen will seem like a hotel compared to this jail. We wonder when and where we will be transferred. Spirits are high, we're all right. Tell our enemies to beware, our friends to organize. Joe Mulloy. Now, Joe was very lucky in that he is a native of Kentucky and felt very much at home in the mountains. He felt that that's where he should be organizing. But when a matter of principle, when he was faced with that, he had to go to jail. But he's lucky that he has a wife like Karen Mulloy, who is continuing the work and will be going to Pike County in eastern Kentucky to continue the organizing there. And I'd like for her to tell you just a word about that. Karen Mulloy.
I'm continuing my work in the mountains, as we all must continue. We are fighting the strip mines battle, as we did last summer with Jink Ray. We have what is known as the Marrowbone Folk School, fashioned after the Highlander Folk School, and all sorts of small battles going on all the time. And we must let no man turn us around. And when Joe is free, he will join all of us who are working in the mountains, continue the fight for freedom and democracy. One of your responsibilities is to help free Joe, to launch a protest against a system that would jail a man that believes that all human beings should be allowed to live, and to live a decent life. Joe read a statement when he was sentenced, and it was not just written for the court, for they didn't really care, but was addressed to the people of the United States, and I'd like to read it to you now. This was April 8th, 1968. I stand before you today for refusing to kill, for refusing to partake in the violent march of history which will eventually, if not stopped, end us all. It is ironic that I stand here today in these trying times, speaking for peace and nonviolence as the country burned down around us from the flames of hatred and violence. America seems bent upon doing itself in. I find an intolerable hypocrisy in the words of our president in the last few days and in the deeds he causes to happen. America shall not be ruled by the bullet, and yet America shall rule the world with bombs and bullets. Men of peace are called upon to use nonviolent methods in dealing with our internal crises, and yet our government relies solely on violence to protect her so-called interests and impose our will around the world. We shall reap what we sow, as the men of nonviolence are jailed and murdered. This is the hypocrisy which I will have no part of. I have chosen the truth of nonviolence as my way of life. What has gone on in this court of law and what you do to me today shall not deter me from that truth. I accept this bitter cup because I love this country. Like Socrates, I had my chance to flee the wrath of the law, but chose to face it head on with my will in the hope that I may change it. What I have done will someday be praised as a true patriotic act, and someday men will learn to live in peace and love. Until that day, you can whip my body and shackle my bones, but you can't touch what I think in my head. I shall always remain free, and we shall overcome. Thank you.
Now I would like to introduce the person who will introduce the guest of honor, the very well qualified historian and movement chronicler, professor at Boston University, and author of The New Abolitionists, Howard Zinn.
This isn't going to be a long introduction because I think the most useful thing I can do is not to stand between you and Ella Baker for very long. I do want to say that I think it was somewhere on the streets of Atlanta. I think it was somewhere in 1958, 59 that I first met Ella Baker, and it was just a passing meeting. And somehow I just was with her for 5-10 minutes, and yet I felt after that meeting, thinking about it, that I'd been in the presence of a remarkable person with enormous strength and passion and hidden wells of wisdom. And then I saw her in 1961 in Albany, Georgia, at the time of the mass demonstrations there, and all sorts of things were going on out in the street, and people were being arrested, and Bob Zellner was hanging around somewhere, coming out of jail, and other people, some of them right here in this room. And in a little church in Albany, back in the dock in the back room, there was a line of people who had just come out of jail, black men and women in Albany. They were sitting there, and there, seated at a table, was Ella Baker. And while all this hoopla and demonstrative action was going on out in the street, Ella Baker was sitting there at this table, talking one by one to these people who'd gotten out of jail to find out what they needed. Did they need some clothes? Had they lost their jobs? Who was taking care of their kids? They need a doctor. And it seems to me that over the years that I've known her, what has really impressed me was that on the one hand, she was always doing the nitty-gritty, down-in-the-earth work that other people were not doing, while all sorts of rhetoric was going on and all sorts of grandstanding was going on. That's what she was doing, working with people and talking to people and organizing people. And yet at the same time, she always had a vision, an intellectual reach, an understanding of what lay beyond today and beyond tomorrow, what lay beyond the immediate events. She always was looking through the things that were occupying people at the moment, thinking of the kind of world, I think, that she and the rest of us thought we were working for, a world without war, without racism, without poverty, in which people could live together as human beings were meant to live together. And then I felt very honored when she and I were both serving together on the executive committee in SNCC in those first few crazy years of SNCC. And she's had a long and remarkable career in the South, where she was born, in the North, where she has traveled and worked among all sorts of people. I listened before as some of the messages said that she is one of the most consequential and yet one of the least honored people in America. And I thought to myself that perhaps this is because we are accepting the going definition of what honor is. If honor is medals and headlines, and plaques and invitations to the White House. Well, that's somebody's definition of honor. And if honor is the love that people have for you, and if honor is the work that people do and the cause that you've dedicated your life to, then Ella Baker is one of the most honored people in America. It's only rarely in one's lifetime that you come across somebody that you consider a truly great person. And that's the feeling I've always had about Ella Baker. It's been a great privilege to know her. It's a great privilege to introduce her to you now. Here she is.
Mr. Chairman and friends, I don't know if I can recall a point in my lifetime that I have been as near speechless as I am tonight. I had said that I'd had great difficulty trying to put down something to say, not only because of tonight's occasion, but because I suppose, like many people who have lived a long while, who've seen a lot of things take place, and who still want to see where we're going, I am among those who are finding it pretty difficult to talk these days in the first place. And tonight I am finding it even more difficult because I must admit I had not responded to this occasion in the way that apparently other people have responded. Maybe I am at fault. But when Anne asked me if the dinner this year might be, quote, built around me, I said yes without any hesitation, because I agreed with one other statement she made, namely, that of course this has elements of using you, but if you're like me, you do not object to being used for a good cause. And as far as I was concerned, this was it. Because irrespective of whatever else could take place tonight, to me the most important reason for being here was for some people who did not know about SCEF to learn about its work, and for others of us who have been involved in its work to gain new life and new dedication to its support. Now, maybe I was wrong in taking this position. Maybe I should have let my ego find some satisfaction in the fact that, quote, I was being honored. But I must admit to you that I have always found it very difficult to play that role, because in my estimation, one must do what one's conscience bids them do, and from no one except yourself expect applause. I have been introduced in various ways in my life. I've had the introductions. Maybe I should be a little bit historical or reminisce a bit. I remember when I traveled for the NAACP in the early 40s and throughout the South, I was weighing then about 40 pounds less than I'm weighing now, and I was 27 years younger. And on many occasions, when I arrived in a place, because the people had been accustomed to seeing what we used to refer to facetiously as bedecked and bebosomed ladies, And here I appeared with neither bedecking nor not too much bebosoming. It was pretty difficult for some of the persons who had to introduce me to find a sense of security in presenting the speaker. And so what they usually would say after some words that maybe could be said about anybody, they said, "And here we have our national officer." And this, of course, meant that they said, "Don't blame me if it isn't all right. It's the national office that sent her." But in '59, I went down to help them in an effort to break through the barriers to voter registration in Caddo Parish, Louisiana. And among the things that we were doing, of course, was getting around to various sections of the community to try to get people to understand what they would have to do in order to qualify to register, and to get them to come out to attempt to register. And on one occasion, after we had been around a while and my work habits had become known, one of the dear brethren who introduced me after he asked the sister he said, "Now if this sister will give us a number on the piano, and then we will have a few words from the old workhorse." And this was what I was supposed to represent. Now, I remember those instances, and I remember hundreds of other instances when I had the privilege of thinking, at least, that I spoke what people were thinking in their hearts. I remember on one occasion, in the height of, I guess, the war that was being fought in the 40s, I spoke at a church in Tampa, Florida. And there were, a couple of hundred of people, about 200 people present. And we were recruiting NAACP memberships. And out of that group, we got about 80 that morning. And one sister got up and said afterwards, she said, "I'm joining because I know what this woman is saying. What she is saying, any mother can understand." Now, I wasn't a mother, but at least I was glad to know that in attempting to communicate, I had communicated with people in terms of their understanding and in terms of their drives. A lot of nice things have been said about me tonight, but I said that my main concern for being here was because this was an occasion to call attention again to the work that SCEF is doing. You've heard it said that this is the 30th anniversary of its existence. And I know of no organization that can measure its effectiveness in terms, it can measure its effectiveness more effectively in terms of the repressions that it and its staff has suffered than SCEF. SCEF, as Anne has indicated, or at least my meeting with Anne and Carl came at the time when they had been accused of a number of things, sedition among them, because they had bought a house and sold it to a Negro veteran who had been unable to buy a home out of the ghetto. And the house was then, I think, bombed, I believe. And the veteran and Carl were accused of having done it themselves. And I met them. I then was strictly a civil rights worker. You know, in the civil rights movement, there was not very much difference made or distinction made between civil rights and civil liberties. In fact, we may not have dwelt too well upon civil liberties in those days. And after meeting Anne and Carl, one of the things that became very clear was that those of us who were engaged, especially the young people at that time, who were engaged in the nonviolent movement, had not understood that the very laws that were being used against them, like freedom, like opposition to assembly, like exorbitant and unusual bail, these were things that had to do with the civil libertarian aspects of a struggle that they knew very little of. But thanks to Anne Braden especially, those who had not known came out of the movement, I think, at least informed, and I trust are now convinced that the struggle has to take on a double effort in the direction of combating the violations of the civil liberties that we claim to have as a result of being a part of the American system. I've often felt that the marches were just, to a large extent, outlets for people finding expression, and they assuaged their sense of guilt, or they did away with any further need for involvement by becoming a part of the march. They are necessarily, no doubt, they are a necessary part of dramatizing a situation. But why march to Washington? Why not march to Long Island? Why not march to Westchester? Why not march to the slums of New Jersey? Why not march to Harlem, to Bedford-Stuyvesant? Not in terms of a physical march, but in terms of recognizing that what is happening in these places in terms of poverty is a responsibility that has to be dealt with by those who are not impoverished. In other words, those of us who have money have got to speak to those who are in power in a way that they understand, which is how? Through the ballot, through your pressure, and through the determination that something has to be done. Poverty, war, we are pretty well on the way to at least dealing with the question of war, but beyond the question of the Vietnam War is the larger question of what kind of foreign policy does the Vietnam War represent, and what kind of foreign policy will there be after the Vietnam War? Does it represent, as has been indicated in some of the things that we've read, that our government has reached a point that it thinks in terms of being the policeman for the rest of the world against what they call the threat of communism? Or is it truthfully said, as some of us think, that it is the representation of those who are in power taking a position against the inherent right of people to seek their own self-determination in the ways that they think are best suited to their problems? Does this represent the kind of foreign policy that you and I, as citizens of this country, want to see followed? If so, that's one thing. But if not, what is our responsibility? Where does our responsibility begin, and where does it end? When we come to the question of racism, this is the ticklish one. It has been said, and we must give credit where credit is due, The first to perhaps utter this were those who are now not very well received, the SNCC people, when they first said that we are in a racist culture, a racist society that is dominated by a racist philosophy and an exploitation that to a large extent is based on racism. It wasn't heard. And now that it has been said, and perhaps to some extent documented perhaps by the report, or the President's report on urban, what is it called? Urban disorders, yes. We call them rebellions, somebody calls them riots, and the President's report refers to them as urban disorders. This report comes out and says that we are tending towards becoming two societies, one black, one white, separate and unequal. Now, the report hasn't said a thing that hasn't been said before, over and over and over again. But the great tragedy is that it wasn't heard. It was said each time there was a protest against racial segregation. It was said each time that people like Stokely Carmichael got his head beaten because he was trying to resist the racist aspects of the Southern society. And then we were much more eager for the fight against racism because of what? It was over there. It was in the South. We could always point the finger. But when it begins to explode at our very doorsteps, what do? We get afraid, and we get fearful. Now, it's understandable. It's understandable that you can be afraid of disorder, but that is not enough to be afraid. There is a need to understand the reason for the disorder. Not an outbreak has taken place, but what there weren't some factors that had obtained for years and years that had helped to create the climate, create the hatred, create the suppressed anger that made it necessary in the minds of the people who gave vent to it the way they did, to do what they did. This, you say, is condoning the rioters. It is not. It is an effort to say to people who say they would like to do something to save a country, it is an effort to say to you and to me that we must understand what takes place on the riot, at the riot level, is a reflection of a lot of things that have not been on the surface before and that have been festering like an old sore. And what happens with an old sore when it festers? Frequently, it infects the entire body. And we are now at that stage, I'm afraid. One of the things about the question of racism that, or at least in talking to people, the question that frequently has come up recently with me is, well, we are not guilty, personally. Of course you're not. I don't know that there's anybody in this room has carried on a campaign of racism per se. But I doubt that there's anybody in this room who has not at some point been guilty of supporting a racist culture. And we must search ourselves to find out how we have been guilty. Not for the sake of just wallowing in our guilt, but for the sake of facing the fact that the future of our culture, of our country, depends not so much on what black people do as it does depend on what white people do. Now, this is a hard lesson for some of us, that the choice as to whether or not we will rid the country of racism is a choice that white America has to make. But you say that when blacks call for separatism, they are guilty of racism in reverse. How many times have you listened when the separatism is echoed? What's behind the call for separatism? There are many things are said, but in my estimation, there are times when the most radical makes the statement that you can't expect anything from Whitey. What he is really saying is, show me. He is begging to be shown. Now, how can you do it? I don't know. I wish I knew how you could show. But one thing is certain. You can't sit back and wait and say, well, if the blacks aren't going to work with me, I don't want to be bothered with them, and I don't want to interfere with their receding. And if someone asks me, well, what can I do? I have only one answer. You have to do some things in terms of what you believe and in terms of your own conviction. And if you're not going to be able to be motivated by your own conviction and not wait for blacks to tell you where to move, then we are doomed. I can assure you I didn't intend this, but I listened to what was being said, and I listened to what was not said when Stokely and Rapp appeared before you. I know there was a great deal of perhaps apprehension as to whether or not things would turn out all right. I understand that the hotel had raised questions of the possibility of riots. And I think what took place in connection with Rapp's appearance in Maryland might be something of a lesson. He has been in jail for a number of weeks, and it was all started because of his appearance in Maryland, Cambridge, Maryland. And you remember all that was said. The story was to the effect that Rapp Brown appeared, spoke, and was followed by a riot. Maybe most of us know all the details, but some of us may not. I'm going to just read a couple of lines, if I can find a way to see, from a newspaper clipping that deals with the question of the Cambridge riots. Before I read this, let me say, this represents a report that was prepared by a team of social scientists headed by a Dr. Robert Shellow, Assistant Deputy Director for Research at the National Institute of Mental Health. And it was prepared as part of the study on the urban disorders. But it wasn't included in there. We have some other documentation of it, but this will serve the purpose. To the extent that Brown encouraged anybody to engage in precipitous or disorderly acts, the city officials are clearly the ones he influenced most. Indeed, the existence of a riot existed for the most part in the minds of city officials. And to the extent that Negro disorders occurred, it can best be interpreted as a response to actions of the city officials. Brown was more a catalyst of white fears than of Negro antagonism. The disturbance more a product of white expectations than of Negro initiative. The 24-year-old Negro leader was indicted on charges of inciting to arson and riot. I think the report points out that the burning at the school took place about 4 hours after he had been shot in the arm by a deputy and after he had left. And that the people in the community really came out and tried to help put out the school blaze. But there is the possibility that the chief of police had decided that he was ready for a riot, and so help him, there had to be one. Those of us who are not ready for the burning will go down to our city halls, go down to our mayors and to our governors and even to our federal government and question why so much artillery is being bought and stacked and stocked to deal with people who are fighting against an oppressive or a repressive system that they have become victim to. The voice of those who believe that life is more sacred than property must be heard now, at no other time. One other thought, and that has to do with the whole question of repressive action. I think it was this week that the 25th anniversary of the Warsaw Ghetto, the resistance in the Warsaw Ghetto took place 25 years ago. Someone has said that those who fail to remember history may live to experience history. What I am suggesting is that the trend towards repressive measures against those who are resisting the war, those who are resisting the racist repressions, those who are resisting the poverty that they endure, those who are challenging a system, more and more the repression is stepped up in terms of what? Eliminating those people in one way or the other, containing them. Rap Brown was sent to jail not because he had been tried and found guilty of a crime, but because he was an easy target. And if we take the position that, sure, I don't believe in that kind of imprisonment, but you must remember what he said, then we aren't really understanding that the real issue is repression. Not repression for whom, but repression against anyone who violates or who is exercising what we say are our constitutional rights of freedom of speech.